Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're doing another upgrade video, this time a model from Sonus Faber. Before I get started though, I want to let you guys know, if you'd like, you can go check out a radio interview that I did with a channel called Full Load that is over on Spotify. So I'll post a link down below and you guys can just click on that and check that out if you're interested. Now, let's dig into this Sonus Faber model. And this is an older one. This is one of their more upscale models. It is the Electra Amateur model. And there's pros and cons on this thing, let me tell you. Looks wise, looks nice. I mean, the way they make this thing, the way the front baffle is done, with the leather wrap around it, it looks nice. There are issues with this speaker though. As with every Sonus Faber we've gotten in thus far, there's been issues where they've really cut corners and they've cheaped out on the internal parts and things like that. And this one is no exception. And it needed a redesign just like every other model of theirs that we've had through here also. Driver-wise, tweeter's a nice tweeter. It's the old Dynaudio Esotar tweeter. So we've worked with that before. We've worked with it in the Merlins and the Eagleston Works speakers. It's a tweeter that's real popular way back in the day. It was really common at one time. And then Dynaudio pulled all of their drivers from the market so that you could only get Dynaudio drivers if you purchased a Dynaudio product. So they pulled it from the DIY market and we saw them dry up after that. The woofer, it says it's got a Dynaudio sticker on it, but I don't recognize this as any Dynaudio product. It's obviously something that maybe they made for Sonus Faber. It looks nice. It's a heavy frame. That's where everything stops right there. And it's a nice cone. It's a paper-based cone, but it has issues. And so that was a problem. Also, the cabinet, while it looks nice, this is solid hardwood. And you can tell looking on the inside, you can see that it's just solid wood. On a good note, it's fairly thick. It's I want to say at least 7/8 of an inch to maybe an inch thick almost. However, there's not a brace in this thing. And hardwoods are the worst material to use for speaker cabinets. They resonate like crazy. So they'll tend to make a lot of noise at certain frequencies. Depending on the resonant frequency of that panel, it's easily excited. So that's not a good thing. Now, the way the woofer's mounted, they chamfered the backside a little bit to do away with some edge diffraction. That's good. They also overlapped it onto this tweeter to get the acoustic centers close together, and that's good. Now, crossover parts. You know, they've got a little crossover back there mounted on the back wall, and they poured some black goo all over it. Yeah, black goo. I don't know if we can see it looking through there, but it is, I guess, their version of hiding or potting it so no one can see the secret sauce, so no one will know what they're doing, which I thought was funny because if you just take a magnet and reach in there and stick to it, it sticks to the iron core inductors. It sticks to the metal chassis on the electrolytic capacitors and on the resistors. And if you hit the back of the binding post, they've got steel washers that are going around the binding post themselves. I'm thinking, oh my goodness, where does it end? You know, this was one of their fairly high-level models in the day, and I'm thinking, man, it's pretty on the outside. Binding posts, though, might be probably brass. I mean, let's face it, they're probably brass. They look good on the outside, though. They look like some decent binding posts. And again, cabinet looks good on the outside, but they dropped the ball in a few areas. And let's get back to this woofer and the issues I had with this woofer, and let's look at the measurements on this thing. The woofer, as nice as it looks, it's got issues in the response. It's got some nasty breakup and some ringing right within its band. If I was Sonus Faber and Dynaudio sent this to me, I would send it right back and say, hell no. You need to get me one that doesn't have these resonance issues. We need something that's going to have a relatively smooth response We don't want to put a whole bunch of parts on this thing to try and control it. You know, something you could do a simple second order filter on and get a nice smooth roll off is great. This speaker here, or this woofer, is not one of those. So there's definitely some response issues, and we're going to see that in the frequency response. So let's look at it first. Let's look at just an on-axis frequency response. And if you look at the average, just going all the way across, it's within about plus or minus 2.5 dB if you don't count the fall at the very top end. And you think, well, that's well within good industry standards. It's within plus or minus 2 dB. But if you look at it, it's actually really choppy through that range. Like if you look at it from 350 or so up to about 650 or 700, there's a 2.5 dB rise right there. And so the dipped areas right in the vocal region and in the upper vocal harmonics, they're almost twice as loud. If it were 3 dB up, that would be what we consider twice as loud. So that's still very imbalanced. It could keep that same plus or minus 2.5 dB if it were smooth all the way across and maybe had a tipped up top end or bottom end or something like that, where maybe a smiley face looking curve, but not something where you're seeing big swings within the frequency response. That's more of an issue. In fact, let's look at the spectral decay, and we can see that some of those peaks down in the woofer's response aren't just amplitude peaks. Those are where we see some stored energy there. There's some resonance there. It's taking longer to release the signal there. So we're exciting the woofer with a signal. It's moving. The signal stopped, but the cone's still moving. And usually what's happening is the cone's moving like this. We're getting out at the edges. They're ringing. Even though the voice coil has stopped, the outer edges of the cone are still moving. That's usually what's going on when we see some of that like that. There's another one way up here at the top of the woofer's curve, close to the crossover, where there's a little peak at 2 kHz. There's another one right there. And let's look at the crossover response. You'll see what's weird is it's crossed fairly high, considering that tweeter will go down fairly low. It's crossing about 2300 hertz or so, which is not bad, but even the curve of the tweeter is not real smooth. In fact, I noticed when I was taking measurements on it that there is some diffraction off of this woofer frame because it surface mounts over the top of it, and it sticks up quite a bit, and there is some surface reflections off of this thing. Going through the rest of the measurements here, looking at the horizontal off-axis, see no issues in the horizontal plane there. It drops off fairly evenly, and in the vertical off-axis, even though it's crossed at a fairly high region, the vertical off-axis looks pretty good because the acoustic centers are fairly close. When they overlap this woofer up onto this tweeter, the acoustic centers are not that far apart, so as you move up or down, you're not changing the time arrival of one driver versus the other quite so much. So it maintains a pretty good vertical off-axis. The impedance response shows it dips to a minimum of only 6.8 ohms, but there's a pretty huge impedance rise at the crossover region. So there's definitely some room for improvement there. And of course, the first thing I do, shoot the response of each driver without a crossover on it. Let's see what's going on. So I did that, and let's throw that up and take a look at it. The tweeter's curve, not too bad. I mean, we can see it's fallen off quite a bit at the very top end, and it's a little bit of roughness there due to these surface reflections off the woofer, but overall not bad. The woofer's response, eek, man, that's bad. That's bad. There's a lot of choppiness there. In fact, let's throw up the spectral decays on both of those. The tweeter spectral decay looks fairly clean, and I'm thinking some of those ridges, because when you see them come down, it's the I got a tongue tangler here. The decay off of it there, where you would see the trace carry further out like that, it's not in the same thing. In other words, we're not seeing a peak that comes out like this. We're seeing a little amplitude peak there, but it dies off, and then you're seeing it kind of pop up. Right next to that, you're seeing a secondary peak that comes up, and that's the one that trails out there. That's when we see something like a surface reflection. That's very indicative of that going on. So overall, other than that, the tweeter's response is really clean. And we recognize that with that tweeter. We've seen it before. It's a decent tweeter, really a good tweeter. Woofer's response, let's look at the spectral decay on that, and you can see it's a mess. There's a lot of stored energy there. In fact, if it were me, I wouldn't use it above 300 or 400 hertz. I'd use it as a woofer only, roll the top end off of it, use something else to play up higher. But it is what it is, and that's what I had to work with. So I had to start putting parts on this thing and try and flatten out this response and try and match the tweeter's response with it. And it took a couple of little notch filters. It took a third order filter and a couple of notch filters right at those peaks to damp those peaks out and create a nice smooth roll off. Let's take a look at it. Let's look at the new crossover response, and you'll see what I'm talking about. In fact, let's throw up the crossover response and compare it to the old crossover response, and you can see a big difference in how the woofer now retains a smoother response and how it just naturally rolls off. Sorry, I keep remembering that the curves are opposite for you guys. So the woofer's response rolls off nice and smooth, and it's not doing this on its way down. Same with the tweeter's response. We were able to flatten it out a little bit more and let it play down flatter and then let it drop off. So as far as how fast it's fallen and the order that it's fallen, not that far off from where it was. It's not playing that much lower than it was, but it's playing flatter than it was, and we're changing the crossover point because we're letting it play flatter longer and then letting it drop. So for instance, at 1 kHz, it's not playing down as really not much more than it was at the 75 dB mark, which is the bottom of this graph. But the crossover point moved from about 2300 hertz down to about 1800 hertz. So we are letting it cover a range that it's comfortable in and then knocking the bottom out of it. And we did that with just a second order filter. So it wasn't like we had to put a whole bunch of parts on there to keep it linear. And let's look at the on-axis response, and let's look at it versus the old on-axis response. You can see what I'm talking about when I say we're keeping things smooth over a wide range, like from down here at the woofer's end. Nice and smooth response transitioning into the tweeter. The tweeter lifts up just a little at the top there, and I left it there. That's the way it was from the factory. And the reason I did is as soon as you start moving off axis, like if you're 10 degrees off axis or so, it flattens out really well. And sometimes just a little bit of tip up there is okay because it's only dead on axis. And by leaving it up a little bit, it kind of helps with the overall room response not to be so rolled off. So let's look at horizontal off axis now, and you can see it's very smooth. And let's look at the vertical off axis, and you can see compared to the old vertical off axis, because the crossover point is a little lower, you can see now moving up or down, it maintains a smoother response all the way across. Also, spectral decay is cleaner. I did everything I could to try and damp out some of those resonances on this thing. And looking at the new spectral decay versus the old spectral decay, you can see I knocked some of that out quite a bit. Also added some insulation in the box, and that helped quite a bit as well because it just didn't have enough. It just had a sheet of foam in there on each side and some on the floor. That's not enough. If you look at the old spectral decay, you can see around that big hump that's, it's around 500 or 600 hertz there, maybe 600 or 700 hertz. You can see it's got a little stored energy there, and it comes out there and it drops off, and it's dropped. And then you see another ridge line kind of pop up out there. That's often indicative of internal reflections. We've got pressure within the box that is not being damped out by what's in the box. And so then the woofer is re-excited by that change in pressure. Think of a pressure wave as going through the box and back out through the woofer again. It's re-exciting it, and then you see this decay structure come on out there. When I added a little more insulation to the box and absorbed some of that, it killed a lot of that down low. Impedance curve. The impedance was at a minimum of 6.8 ohms, and now it's a minimum of 4.4 ohms. So we dropped the impedance a little bit, and it's on the woofer end. And that's because I had to put a couple of those notch filters in there to control those peaks. And anytime you do those notch filters in shunt like that, you're taking power that the woofer would normally see and cause a peak, and you're re-shunting that power back to the amplifier instead of letting the woofer play it. So we're controlling the woofer, and we're adding damping right there at that spot, but it also means that the amplifier sees it as a lower impedance, which is a good trade-off in this case. We're still in a good range. And the impedance is now nice and balanced all the way across. We did away with that huge impedance rise, so the amplifier is going to see it more as an even load all the way across. So that was what I was able to do with this thing. And for this customer, I'm putting together a new parts package. No more cheesy stuff. I'm sorry, Sonus Faber. I know you make some really high-end stuff, really expensive stuff, and I can't help but think, what are you putting in those speakers? Like, do you only save high-end parts for the top-level models, or do those top-level models also use some of these bottom-of-the-barrel budget parts? I'd love to hear a response from you guys, and you guys tell me what you got going on there, because I know you make some beautiful products. Cabinet-wise, some of the most beautiful cabinets in the industry, and I know you've got some really high pricey products, but some of these that I've had through here aren't indicative of that level of performance. So let me know what you think on that if you want. Let me think, what else did I need to cover on this one? I'm going to throw in some no-res for this guy with this model. This thing really needed it. You can get away with hardwoods if they're fairly thick and well braced, and then you add some no-res to the inside of it. You can damp out any of the resonances of these hardwood panels. But hardwood is not the way to go. If you're DIYing this stuff and you think, I really want this radiused hardwood look, bond it with an inside skin of MDF. Do MDF and then the hardwood over it. Glue that stuff together really well. Make a solid plank out of it. The MDF will help damp out the resonances. And anytime you've got materials that have different resonance frequencies that are bonded together, it tends to damp out any resonance. For instance, if the MDF has a resonance down low, the hardwood has a resonance a little up higher, they tend to damp each other out a little bit. And that helps a lot. Rather than using one material that's going to have one resonance frequency at one spot, now you got something you got to deal with. So anytime you're wanting to do hardwoods on a DIY project, especially on the front baffle, you can really get away with it more on the front baffle because you're cutting everything out of it and it becomes more of a frame. Whereas when you put it on the side panels, you've got a big panel that can resonate. There's surface area there, and that's what you don't want to have. So for you guys thinking to do that, don't do that. Skin it with hardwood if you want, but it's difficult to just use solids. Unless, like I said, you brace it really well and you add no-res or something on the inside, you can get away with it. But typically, it's not a good material. It also tends to expand and move and grow with changes in humidity, and MDF isn't as likely to do that. It's more inert. It's a denser material. So for many reasons, it's not a good material to make speakers out of, doing hardwoods. But we do see it sometimes. It is pretty. I give it that to them. It is pretty. All right, I think that's it for this video. I appreciate you guys watching, and we'll see you guys in the next one.